Now, somebody who's also been robust in his questioning in the past is Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, who joins me now. Sir Richard, lovely to speak to you this Sunday morning. Thanks very much for your time. I mean, this is the week that we've seen 5 Bulgarians arrested for suspected spying on behalf of Russia. We've obviously had the Chinese spying scandal in Parliament. So, Richard, what's your view? Have we got a problem with espionage that might have escalated in recent years?
Well, it may have escalated on the Chinese side, and I think the Chinese probably have become more active over the last decade. On the Russian side, it's a problem that's been there since the end of the Cold War. There hasn't been a break in Russian espionage activity. It's just continued at much the same level. But every now and again, you see a bit more of the iceberg above the water.
Chinese spying story involving a researcher who had been able to get a pass into Parliament. Does that worry you? Does it surprise you? Or has this stuff always happened and perhaps been thwarted by MI6 and others before the public's even got to know about it?
Well, I think there's a lot that you don't learn, and that's not surprising because it's kept secret. It doesn't appear in the public domain. I think the case in Parliament indicates that foreign governments that are hostile to us always take an interest in political activity and try and exercise influence in any way that they can. Not sure exactly the character of this case in Parliament. It is, it's unusual. We haven't had a case quite like that. Bear in mind, you had this lady, Lee, this solicitor in London quite recently, who, when she was identified, saw his influence, did a runner and disappeared overseas. I think we have a similar case probably with this young man.
I thought it was interesting as well when you said about the Cold War, the repositioning of our relationship with China. There's been quite a lot of political debate about this. Have we been too close to the Chinese under Cameron and Osborne? Should we now put some distance between us, as was advocated by Liz Truss? How should we be managing our relationship with China?
With great care is my answer. And I think if you go back, yes, we were rather naive. I mean, I've said this publicly before. I've criticised David Cameron and George Osborne for being far too enthusiastic to get close to China. Now, we have a close relationship, a close economic relationship, but that relationship needs to be conducted with our eyes wide open, realising the downside, the dangers, the difficulties of dealing with China, when, you know, their attitude towards us is not entirely one of cooperation and friendliness. They don't believe in win-win. They believe in we win, you lose.
I was speaking to a defence and security expert in Parliament last week who was talking about the fear of the threat to our cyber and other infrastructure. There's been talk in the past about the vulnerability perhaps of some of the undersea cables which connect us to the rest of the world and are responsible for a lot of our internet and other infrastructure. Is that a key concern, Sir Richard, that I would understand has escalated in recent times because of the technological advances we've all made? It might actually make us more vulnerable.
Well, I think the Russians specifically did develop and have sophisticated means for attacking undersea cables. I think that we've probably had some incidents which aren't necessarily proven. For example, the cable to the Shetland Islands was cut earlier, I think last year. Yeah, it's a problem, it's a vulnerability, and I think it's one that the UK, being an island, is very, very conscious of. And there are measures, I'm sure, being taken to, you know, defend that part of our infrastructure, which is so critical.
What's your analysis of Putin at the moment? I know you've raised concerns in the past about his health. He appeared with Kim Jongun quite recently. His legs seem to be tapping a lot. What's your assessment of his current state, Sir Richard?
Well, I'm not a clinician. And, you know, anything that we say about that is likely guesswork. But I mean, I do have quite a few medical friends who watch him carefully, and the consensus seems to be that he might have Parkinson's. But I gather that Parkinson's comes in different forms, and it isn't necessarily it's an illness that can be controlled, or it's an illness that can be much, much more serious. I'm not going to as it were, claim medical knowledge, but I think that there's a fair amount of evidence to indicate there's something wrong with him.
What's your prediction on how his reign at the Kremlin might come to an end? Unseated by somebody on the inside?
Well, I think there are two possibilities. You could have someone within his group sort of depose him, or so that the same people remain. And I think the lead candidate for that would be someone like Nikolai Patrushev, who's head of his Security Council, former head of the internal KGB, known now as the FSB. So that's one possibility. I mean, the other possibility is something much more serious, and as it were, a change of regime. I think a lot really depends now on what happens in Ukraine. I mean, if Ukraine does regain all of its territory so that you have, let's say, a defeat of Russia, I think the implications then are much, much more serious. Maybe the war going badly, but hanging on to some of the territory is a different scenario. I mean, the problem that we have...
I say, what's your prediction for that? Because obviously we've seen the Ukrainians make some gains this weekend in Crimea. They've obviously knocked out a key strategic Russian target. When it comes to reclaiming the territory that they've lost, what likelihood is there of that, do you think, Sir Richard?
I don't think we can yet predict that. The military initiative is definitely with the Ukrainians at the moment. The offensive is going slowly. But when I was in Ukraine earlier this year, they were quite clear that there wouldn't be a magical counteroffensive. There would be a series of punches, a series of initiatives. And I think, you know, their progress on the battlefield now, I think, depends on our determination to support and to continue to arm them. And I mean, for example, the American supply of ATACMS, these longer range missiles, things like that can really tip the balance in their favor. But clearly they're making progress in the south, and they've made some quite optimistic statements recently, and their attack on Sevastopol clearly was strategically significant and an important sort of morale booster. So we have to wait and see what happens over the next few months, and then of course there'll be probably another offensive next spring after a reduction of fighting in the winter.
I was wondering whether there's a fear perhaps that the West is growing a little weary. I note what you're saying about the long-range missiles from the US. We had Boris Johnson writing in The Spectator an edition ago saying we really need to step up our support. And actually there has been this, well, ongoing weariness from the likes of Germany and other European countries. And then Poland and this grain deal, perhaps jeopardising their support for the Ukraine.
Yeah, there are problems. There's a problem with Poland, but I think this is largely related to the forthcoming Polish election, and you know the rural vote for the current government and winning that election. So it's a spat. I don't think it's going to, as it were, undermine ultimately the strategic relationship between Poland and the Ukraine.
No.
War weariness, yes. I mean, there are problems in Germany. You know, if you look at the sort of polling in relation to Ukraine, there are problems in France, Slovakia. And then, of course, one has the concern of Trump and the possible Trump presidential candidature. These are problems, but...
on that subject, Sir Richard...
I'm not going to predict how it's going to turn out, but so far, so good. We're sustaining our support for the Ukrainians, and that's important.
Quick answer to this one, Sir Richard, if you don't mind. On that subject, who's a bigger threat to Western democracy, Donald Trump or an increasingly bewildered Joe Biden?
I think Trump is probably the worst outcome of the two.
It's a bit of a Hobson's choice, though, isn't it, Sir Richard?
It is indeed, and maybe neither will be presidential candidates.
Thank you very, very much indeed for your time this morning, Sir Richard Dearlove.